Greetings! In this video I'll be painting an Intercessor from the Flesh Tearers chapter. This was a requested chapter by some viewers, and I've had the model built for a while, but I've held back on painting it until I could get a dark red recipe that I liked. For the build I used an Infernus Marine body and some arms from the Space Wolves kits, plus one of the old Mark 7 helmets for that angry look, and the pauldron with the chapter armorial is from the old Deathwatch kit. After assembly I primed the model black with my airbrush, though of course you could use a spray can primer for a similar result. Onto painting now, starting with the armour. I applied a few coats of Wordbearer's red to form the base coat for the red armour. The power pack, shoulders and helmet will remain black, but I wasn't worried if I hit them with the red as they'd need cleaning up later anyway. Onto cleaning up the black bits now, using Black Legion. The soft armour connection points and the armour pieces that I mentioned earlier get base coated in black. Now onto the little details around the model. I'm doing these now because they can be hard to reach, and if I make any mistakes while doing them it goes onto the armour, which is a fairly simple thing to clean up. I used Rhinox hide to base coat the leather, and the string wrap thing on his arm that holds the teeth ornament to his wrist. Zandri dust was then used to paint in the parchment for the purity seal on the left fold, and also to base coat the teeth trophy. Last of these details to base coat was the wax for the purity seal, for which I used Screamer Pink to block in. To detail these details, I used some Skrag brown to paint in some rough highlights with a bunch of lines visible, to add some visual interest. Note that this was only done over the leather details, and not the string on his wrist. To highlight the string, I used some Karak stone. This is a stark difference over the Rhinox hide, but I think it works well with the rough application that I did. Deathclaw brown was next, finishing the texture work on the leather details. This is mainly done over the parts I want it to be most obvious and stand out. Now going back to the parchment, which received a pass with Ushabti bone, building up the colour on the surfaces that I felt were most exposed and leaving the inner curves as the darker base coat. Note that I also did a pass with this over the teeth. Then Screaming Skull was used, doing some rough final highlights of the parchment and the teeth, focusing towards edges and adding a little bit of texture. And finally, to finish the wax, I used Pink Horror, hitting the edges and putting a little bit in the middle as well. Next I used Ulthuan grey to paint in all the markings around the model. This included the buzzsaw pattern for the chapter armorial, the battle line tactical marking on the other pauldron, and a squad number that I decided to freehand on. I figured it'd be less time consuming to paint one than to deal with decals, whilst also trying to improve my freehanding skill. I think it came out pretty good. Now going back to Black Legion to paint in some little scribbles on the purity seal, as well as cleaning up where I went over with white paint on the pauldrons. Then painting in a marking for 5th Company on the battle line tactical marking. The Flesh Tearers use a system that merges the typical Codex Astartes markings and the Blood Angels Company markings, with a black blood drop signifying 5th Company. And now back to the armour, to try and highlight it and make a nice dark red recipe. I tried using some Mephiston red and did some edge highlights, alongside doing some thin layers building up where I wanted the bright sections to be. I should probably call this a glaze, but I'm not confident enough with my abilities in thinning paints to that consistency to call it one. But the application method's the same. Evil Sunz Scarlet was next, reinforcing the previous highlights but primarily focusing on the edges. This helps to make the somewhat large pass with Mephiston red still have visible edges. If you cover an area enough with a colour, it tends to look flat, and this can help alleviate that by picking out the edges. Now for the eyes and wrist lights, using some warpstone glow for a nice green base coat. The first highlight for these bits was with Sybarite green, applied over most of the surface area but avoiding the recesses. Gauss Blaster green was then used in an even smaller area for a glow effect. I wanted a cool green for the eyes as the armour's a warm red, and I felt having a warm red and a neutral black would work well against a cool green. With the eyes done, I moved over to Corvus black to start highlighting the black armour. I'd normally skip to a brighter tone, but I wanted to keep the black looking black. And I know these dark colours look great after a matte varnish, so I just had to stick with the process. Without the varnish, it's a bit too shiny and it just looks a bit weird to me. I applied highlights with Corvus black in a similar manner to that of the red armour, focusing on exposed panels that are receiving light, and of course along the edges. I also used it to clean up around the eyes where I'd spilled over with some green. The next colour was Eshin Grey, used in smaller areas and mostly along the edges. This was the brightest colour that I used to highlight the black, focusing on some rough edge highlights and a few intentional scratches, just to add a little bit of weathering. Now for the small bits of gold around the armour. The reference shows the skull on the Imperialis as gold, so I used some Retributor armour for that bit. I also used this for the little metal pieces that hold the teeth trophies on the wrist. Sticking with the metallics, I switched to gunmetal grey to paint in the various metal details around the model, like the weapons, power pack, helmet, and the little detector unit on his belt. To highlight the gunmetal grey, I used some duraluminum, going along edges and dotting rivets. I really like these two colours, but there are a bunch of similar grey metallics in the metal colour range that would work equally as well. Now onto a black enamel panel liner, which I use as an all-over weathering pass. This works well to shade the recesses and thus emphasise the raised panels, which can strengthen the red a little bit by darkening colours that are near it. I used some enamel thinner on some cotton tips to clean off some smooth surfaces that I wanted to be, well, cleaner. These are some cheap cotton tips that you get in most stores. They tear apart quickly and can leave fibres behind, but they're okay for how cheap they are. I'm going to get some proper ones when I run out of these, but I've got a few hundred of them in the one box and I don't want to waste them. After the enamel had dried enough, I applied my usual basing method, painted the base rim black, and then sealed everything in with some ultramatte varnish. And here we have it, an Intercessor from the Flesh Tearers chapter. I'm really pleased with how this one came out, especially happy with the red. It looks great in person, but the cameras I've used seem to struggle with recording red properly. They lose the warmth or saturation from the colour. It's a little strange, but I've done some minor tweaks to this clip to closer match how it looks in real life. The idea of editing clips like this, it kind of feels disingenuous, but the raw footage doesn't match the real thing, so I guess I gotta do some colour correction. With the settings I tweaked, the gold on the model looks a bit too orange compared to real life, but otherwise the rest of the model's pretty spot on. But either way, I think this red recipe is definitely the way to go for dark reds going forward. Starting with the Wordbearer's red as the base coat and building up the tones that I'd use as the starting point for a brighter red. It worked well. When I do brighter red, I can just go up to a light orange like Wild Rider red or Tau Light Ochre, instead of staying at Evil Sunz Scarlet. When I store this model away in the drawer with all the other ones I've done for videos, I can see how different each red I've done in the past has been. I might do a comparison at some point, or maybe a video that shows all the models I've painted for the channel. Might be a fun way to see how much I've done, considering this is my 89th video after all. But anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll stick around for the next one.